She didn't speak. She couldn't. But the way she clung to a tarnished brass locket told a story of terror that words never could. This was Ilara, a ghost in a city of shadows, and her arrival at the door of the most broken man in the gun quarter was about to ignite a fire that all the soot in England couldn't smother. If you've ever felt like the world was designed to crush the honest while the wicked sat on thrones of gold, then you need to stay with me until the very end of this story. This isn't just a tale of revenge. It's a masterclass in how a man with nothing left to lose can use his own pain to dismantle a tyrant. Do me a favor right now. Rate the intensity of this opening from 1 to 10 in the comments and subscribe to the channel so you never miss these journeys into the darkest corners of history. In 1884, Birmingham was known as the workshop of the world, but to those who lived in its lungs, it was a soot-choked purgatory. The sun was nothing more than a pale copper coin struggling to pierce a permanent shroud of coal smoke. It was a place of rhythmic, bone-deep thudding from steam hammers and the hellish orange glow of blast furnaces that never went cold. In the heart of this iron labyrinth lived Silas Thorne. Silas looked like a man who had been forged rather than born. His hands were a gnarled roadmap of scars, and his lungs carried the heavy, rhythmic rasp of a lifetime spent inhaling iron filings. He was a master blacksmith, or at least he used to be. Once the pride of the guild, a man whose work was sought by the finest armories in the country, he was now a ghost, working out of a crumbling forge where the roof leaked and the tea was always cold. Silas lived in a world of damp shadows, his only company the memories that clawed at him every time he closed his eyes. 10 years ago, his life had ended in a single deafening roar. A catastrophic boiler explosion at the Stirling Ironworks had claimed the lives of 20 workers, including Silas's wife Sarah and their infant son. The owner of the works, Lord Alistair Stirling, a man the locals called the King of Iron because of his absolute ruthless grip on the city's industry, couldn't afford a scandal. To avoid a massive lawsuit and the shuttering of his empire, Stirling had paid off the inspectors and blamed Silas for a mechanical failure in a part Silas had supposedly serviced. In one afternoon, Silas Thorne lost his family, his reputation, and his livelihood. He went from a craftsman of honor to a pariah of the gun quarter. But the universe has a strange way of balancing the scales when the weight of injustice becomes too heavy to bear. It happened on a night when the fog was so thick you could carve it with a knife. Silas was hunched over his anvil, tapping aimlessly at a scrap of iron just to feel the vibration in his bones, when the door creaked open. There stood Ilara. She was perhaps 12 years old, a scullery ghost from Stirling's manor. These were the invisible children, the ones small enough to scrub the soot from the marble floors and the grease from the gears of the great house. Her throat had been scorched by lye during a cleaning accident years prior, leaving her mute. A perfect servant for a man who hated the sound of complaints. She didn't ask for food, she didn't ask for money, she simply held out that tarnished locket. When Silas opened it, expecting to see a faded photograph of a mother long gone, he found something far more disturbing. It was a dried, pressed leaf with 3 distinct leaflets. To any city dweller it was a weed, a bit of greenery from the countryside. But Silas had spent his youth on the rural edges of the West Midlands before the smoke took over. He knew exactly what it was. It was a specimen of a rare imported North American vine that Lord Stirling kept in his prized great conservatory, the Toxicodendron radicans, or poison ivy. Stirling was a man who loved to dominate everything, and his hobby was cultivating exotic, dangerous plants, a testament to his power over nature itself. As Silas looked from the leaf to the girl's terrified eyes, he realized this wasn't just a plant. It was a warning. Ilara had seen something in that conservatory, something Stirling didn't want known. But before Silas could even begin to process the girl's presence, the heavy thud of boots sounded outside. The door was kicked open, and the freezing night air rushed in, bringing with it 2 of Stirling's personal enforcers, men with faces like bruised fruit and eyes that held no more soul than the iron they protected. They didn't come for the girl, at least not yet. They came with a command from the King of Iron himself. Lord Stirling was preparing for a lavish military gala to honor a visiting European monarch, a night designed to cement his status as the premier industrialist of the age. He wanted a ceremonial helmet, a masterpiece of polished steel and gold inlay, to be presented as a gift from the people of Birmingham. It was a lie, of course. The people of Birmingham hated him, but Stirling wanted a symbol of his own kingship over the industrial north. He had sent his men to Silas because, despite the disgrace, everyone knew Silas Thorne was still the only man capable of forging a helmet that could look a king in the eye. The ultimatum was simple and cruel. "Forgive and forget," the lead enforcer sneered, dropping a heavy bag of coin onto the workbench. "His lordship wants the helmet finished in 10 days. It must be lined with the finest crimson velvet, soft as a lady's hand. If it is anything less than perfection, or if you refuse, the girl goes to the Newhall Street workhouse tonight. His lordship says he owns her indenture, and he's tired of her clumsy ways." Silas looked at Alara, who was trembling so violently she could barely stand. The Newhall Street workhouse was a death sentence for a child like her, a place of starvation, disease, and backbreaking labor. But there was something else in the enforcer's words. The finest crimson velvet. Stirling wanted a mask that looked soft on the inside, but remained cold and hard beneath, a reflection of his own vanity. And in that moment, as Silas felt the heat of the forge behind him and the cold of the injustice before him, something inside his broken heart finally snapped. He wasn't just going to make a helmet, he was going to make a statement. He realized that Stirling wasn't just a businessman. He was a parasite who had itched at the lives of the poor for decades, causing irritation and pain while he grew fat on their labor. Silas decided then and there to give the King of Iron exactly what he deserved. "Tell your master I will do it," Silas said, his voice a low growl that sounded like stones grinding together. "Tell him the helmet will be fit for a conqueror. It will be a gift he never forgets." The men laughed, thinking they had broken the old blacksmith one last time. They left with a warning to keep the girl working and out of sight, unaware that they had just handed Silas the tools for his own resurrection. But Silas knew that he couldn't just stuff leaves into a hat. He was a master craftsman, and if he was going to take down a giant, he had to do it with the precision of a surgeon. As the door closed, Silas turned to Alara. He didn't see a scullery girl anymore. He saw an ally. He knew that if he was going to succeed, he would need more than just the leaf in her locket. He would need the very essence of the poison Stirling kept in his glass palace. But how could a disgraced blacksmith and a mute girl infiltrate the most heavily guarded manor in Birmingham? And even if they did, how could Silas use his craft to turn a symbol of luxury into an instrument of agonizing justice? The plan was forming in his mind, a dark alchemical brew of fire and fury, but he knew the risks. If he was caught, it wouldn't just be the workhouse for Alara, it would be the gallows for him. The tension in the forge was thick enough to choke on as Silas began to clear his workbench. He hadn't felt this kind of purpose in 10 years. He looked at his scarred hands, then at the girl who had brought him the spark of life. This was the beginning of the end for Lord Alistair Stirling. But as Silas began to sketch the design for the helmet, a terrifying thought crossed his mind. He was going to have to work with the poison himself. He would have to distill it, handle it, and breathe its fumes. To destroy the man who ruined his life, Silas Thorne would have to be willing to destroy himself first. He looked at the small pressed leaf one more time. It was a tiny thing, fragile and dry, but he knew that within it lay the power to make a king scream. The itch was beginning, not just in the plant, but in Silas's soul. He had 10 days to create a masterpiece of misery. 10 days to forge a crown that would melt the mask right off the face of the King of Iron. And as the first hammer strike rang out through the foggy night, Silas Thorne knew that the mechanical failure Stirling had lied about 10 years ago was finally about to become a reality. Only this time it wouldn't be Silas who paid the price. But what would happen when the velvet finally touched the skin? What kind of monster would be revealed when the armor was stripped away? The answer was waiting in the heat of the forge, and Silas was ready to burn. The hammer didn't just strike the iron. It struck at the very heart of the silence that had buried Silas Thorne for 10 long years. Every ring of the anvil was a heartbeat, a steady, pulsing reminder that he was still alive, and that the man who had stolen his world was finally within his reach. But the path to justice was paved with a fire that Silas had never before dared to stoke. To destroy a monster, he was discovering, One had to be prepared to walk through the same flames that forged the beast. As the first night turned into a second, and the second into a third, the small forge in the gun quarter became a laboratory of misery and hope, where the air grew thick with the scent of scorched iron and something far more sinister, a sweet, sickly smell that clung to the back of the throat, like a memory you couldn't quite wash away. The first obstacle was the most physical. Urushiol, the invisible oil of the poison ivy, was not a substance that yielded easily to the clumsy hands of a blacksmith. Silas was used to the bite of sparks and the searing heat of the furnace, but this was a different kind of pain. It was a creeping, insidious heat. As he spent the dark hours of the night distilling the leaves Ilara had brought him, boiling them down into a thick, viscous resin in a blackened pot tucked away behind the coal bin, his own skin began to betray him. His forearms, usually as tough as cured leather, were now erupting in angry, weeping blisters. The fumes from the distillation made his eyes water, and his breath come in short, jagged gasps. He was literally melting his own flesh to create the instrument of Sterling's downfall. But every time he looked at his raw red hands, he saw the faces of Sarah and his son in the embers, and the pain became a fuel rather than a burden. But he wasn't alone in his suffering, nor was he alone in his work. Lord Sterling's men were like vultures circling a dying animal. A man named Miller, a brute with a face like a slab of cold sweet and a permanent sneer, would drop by the forge at the most unpredictable hours. He would lean against the doorframe, the light of the gas lamps in the street catching the brass knuckles he wore openly on his belt. "His lordship is an impatient man, Thorne," Miller would drawl, his eyes darting around the cluttered forge. "He doesn't like to be kept waiting, and he certainly doesn't like the smell of whatever rot you're cooking up in here. Is this how a master blacksmith works? In a pigsty of weeds and shadows?" Silas would keep his head down, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, his raw hands hidden beneath a pair of heavy, grease-stained leather gloves. He knew that if Miller ever caught a glimpse of the blisters, the game would be over before the first gold inlay was set. And then there was Ilara. The girl was a shadow, moving through the forge with a grace that was unnerving. She didn't speak, but she saw everything. She saw the way Silas winced when he gripped the tongs. She saw the way he stared at the crimson velvet he had purchased with the blood money Sterling had provided. The velvet that was supposed to be the soft lining of the king's helmet. Ilara knew the manner better than anyone. In the quiet moments between the roar of the bellows, she began to draw for him. Using a piece of charcoal on the dusty floor of the forge, she sketched the layout of Sterling's private study. She showed him the heavy oak desk, the towering bookshelves, and most importantly, a small recessed panel behind a portrait of Sterling's father. Through gestures and the intensity in her eyes, Silas realized that Ilara wasn't just a victim seeking refuge. She was a witness. She was telling him about the Iron Ledger. It was the book where Sterling kept the real accounts, the ones that showed the bribes paid to the inspectors after the boiler explosion, the insurance claims filed for equipment he had sabotaged himself, and the list of men he had ruined to build his empire. The helmet was the distraction, the vessel for Silas's vengeance, but the ledger was the key to their salvation. If they could get that book, they wouldn't just hurt Sterling, they would erase him. But the ledger was locked away in a fortress of marble and gold, and the only way to get to it was through the chaos that the helmet would eventually cause. As the days bled into one another, the emotional weight of the task began to crush Silas. He found himself talking to Ilara, or perhaps talking to the ghost of his wife through Ilara. "He thinks he's untouchable," Silas muttered one night, his voice thick with exhaustion, as he carefully brushed the concentrated poison resin onto the underside of the velvet. "He thinks because he owns the factories and the houses and the very air we breathe that he is a god. But even gods bleed, Ilara, especially the ones made of iron." He looked at the girl who was sitting on a pile of burlap sacks, her eyes fixed on the tarnished locket in her lap. "I lost everything because I was honest. I thought that if I did my work well and looked after my own, the world would be fair. I was a fool." He reached out, his gloved hand trembling, and touched the girl's shoulder. "You don't have to be afraid of the workhouse anymore. I promise you, by the time that helmet comes off his head, there won't be anyone left to send you there." Ilara looked up at him, and for the first time, a small, fragile smile touched her lips. It was a moment of connection that went beyond the soot and the pain. Silas realized that he wasn't just fighting for his dead family anymore. He was fighting for the living girl in front of him. This was his chance to be the father he was never allowed to be. But the cost of that redemption was rising by the hour. The real horror, however, was the alchemy of the poison itself. Silas had discovered that the urushiol was most potent when mixed with a specific type of animal fat, creating a cream that would remain dormant until it was warmed by the heat of a human body. It was a masterpiece of Victorian chemistry, born from the desperation of a man with a broken soul. He spent hours practicing the application, ensuring that the velvet remained soft and luxurious to the touch, while the fibers were saturated with the concentrated oil. To the naked eye, it was the finest lining in England. To the skin, it was a ticking time bomb of cellular agony. But as the deadline approached, a new obstacle emerged that threatened to derail everything. Sterling, ever the micromanager of his own ego, sent word that he would be visiting the forge personally to inspect the work. He didn't trust Miller to judge the quality of the gift for the monarch. The news hit Silas like a physical blow. The forge was currently a crime scene. The smell of the poison was everywhere and the distillation pot was still warm. If Sterling stepped inside, he would surely see the girl, notice the odd smells, or worse, demand to see Silas's hands. "Hide the girl," Silas whispered to himself, his mind racing. "Hide the pot. Hide the truth." He had only an hour before the King of Iron arrived. He frantically scrubbed the floor, throwing sawdust over the charcoal drawings Ilara had made. He shoved the distillation equipment into the darkest corner of the coal bin, covering it with heavy iron plates. He told Ilara to hide in the crawl space beneath the forge floor, a damp, spider-infested hole where he used to store spare parts. The girl went without a word, her eyes wide with terror, but her resolve as hard as the iron Silas worked. When the carriage pulled up outside, a gleaming black-lacquered monstrosity pulled by 4 perfectly matched horses, Silas stood at his anvil, his leather gloves pulled tight, his face a mask of soot-streaked indifference. Lord Alistair Sterling stepped into the forge like a conqueror entering a defeated city. He was a man of sharp angles and expensive silk, his moustache waxed to a point, his eyes cold and calculating. He didn't look at Silas as a man. He looked at him as a tool that had been slightly damaged but was still functional. "Thorn," Sterling said, his voice smooth and cold, like a razor blade hidden in velvet. "I trust the work is progressing. The gala is in 3 days. The Duke is expecting a display of Birmingham's finest craftsmanship. I would hate for the people to disappoint him." He walked over to the workbench where the helmet sat, its steel surface polished to a mirror finish, the gold inlay gleaming in the dim light. Silas held his breath as Sterling reached out a hand, a soft white hand that had never known a day of real labor, and touched the metal. "Beautiful," Sterling murmured, a predatory glint in his eyes. "Cold. Hard. Perfect." He then turned his attention to the crimson velvet lying next to the helmet, waiting to be stitched inside. Silas felt his stomach drop. Sterling picked up the velvet, rubbing it between his thumb and forefinger, the very fabric that Silas had saturated with the poison just hours before. The blacksmith's heart hammered so hard he was sure Sterling could hear it. If the oil was already active, if it had leaked through the fibers. "This velvet," Sterling said, pausing, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Silas. "It feels different, heavier than the samples I saw." Silas forced himself to speak, his voice a rasping growl. "It's the grade, my lord. I chose a thicker pile to support the weight of the steel. A king should feel the comfort of the lining as much as the strength of the armor." Sterling stared at him for what felt like an eternity, his gaze searching Silas's face for any sign of deception. Silas didn't blink. He stood his ground, the blisters on his hands screaming beneath his gloves, the girl he was protecting hiding just inches beneath Sterling's polished boots. "It's a pity you were so careless with my boiler 10 years ago. You might have been a wealthy man by now." Sterling turned to leave, but stopped at the door. 3 days. If that helmet is not at the manor by sunset on the 3rd day, the girl is gone. Do you understand? "I understand perfectly, my lord," Silas replied, his eyes fixed on the back of Sterling's head. As the carriage pulled away, Silas collapsed against the anvil, his breath coming in ragged sobs. He had survived the encounter, but the clock was now ticking faster than ever. He pulled Ilara out of the crawl space, the girl covered in dust and cobwebs, but alive. They looked at each other, and in that moment the plan shifted. The helmet was ready for the lining, the poison was set, but they still needed the ledger. The turning point had arrived. Silas realized that he couldn't wait for the gala to steal the book. He had to use the delivery of the helmet as his entry point. He would be the one to bring the gift to the manor. He would be the one to ensure the helmet was placed exactly where Sterling would find it. And while the King of Iron was admiring his own reflection, Silas Thorne would be in the shadows, reclaiming the truth that had been stolen from him. But as he picked up the needle to begin the final stitching of the velvet into the steel, Silas noticed something that chilled his blood. A small drop of the resin had leaked through a seam and onto the outer surface of the helmet. If he didn't clean it perfectly, anyone who touched the metal would be affected. The margin for error was now 0. He was working with a weapon that could destroy him as easily as his enemy. But as he looked at Ilara, who was now quietly sharpening a small file, he knew there was no turning back. The itch of justice was far more powerful than the fear of the flame. And the King of Iron was about to find out that when you build an empire on the broken bodies of the poor, the foundation eventually turns to poison. The night of the great gala arrived like a fever dream, draped in silk and illuminated by the harsh, flickering hiss of thousands of gas jets. Sterling Manor sat atop the hill like a crown of light, its windows glowing with an artificial warmth that did nothing to thaw the frozen hearts of the elite gathered within. Outside, the carriage horses stamped their hooves in the slush, their breath blooming in the frigid air, while inside the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, roasting meats, and the suffocating arrogance of the powerful. This was Lord Alistair Sterling's moment, the night he would present a masterpiece of Birmingham iron to a visiting monarch and solidify his place as the undisputed king of the North. But as the carriages rolled up the gravel drive, a humble delivery wagon sat at the service entrance, its driver a man with a scarred face and hands hidden deep within heavy leather gloves. Silas Thorne felt the weight of the helmet in its wooden crate, as if it were made of lead rather than steel. Next to him, hidden beneath a coarse wool blanket, Ilara was a statue of silent resolve. This was the point of no return. They were inside the lion's den, and the lion was already preening for his kill. Silas moved through the servants' corridors with the practiced invisibility of a man who had spent his life being ignored. He reached the staging room where the gifts were to be presented, and there he saw Miller, Sterling's brute, standing guard. Silas kept his head low, sliding the crate onto the velvet-covered table. "Is it done, blacksmith?" Miller grunted, not even looking up from his flask. "His lordship is already dressing. He wants to see it before the Duke arrives." "It is done," Silas replied, his voice a dry whisper. "A masterpiece fit for a king." As Miller took the crate toward the master's dressing suite, Silas didn't leave. Instead, he slipped back into the shadows where Ilara was waiting. She tugged at his sleeve, pointing toward the grand staircase that led to the private wing. They had 10 minutes, perhaps less. The ballroom was beginning to swell with the sound of a string quartet, a melody that felt like a funeral march to Silas's ears. They moved like ghosts through the opulent hallways, past portraits of men who had built their fortunes on the broken bones of the gun quarter. The room smelled of old paper and expensive tobacco. Ilara didn't hesitate. She moved to the portrait of Sterling's father and felt along the edge of the frame. There was a soft click, the sound of a secret finally being told. The panel swung open, revealing the iron ledger. Silas grabbed the heavy, leather-bound book, his heart racing. He flipped the pages, and there it was, the entries from 10 years ago, the payments to the inspectors, the sabotage of the boiler, the insurance payout that had transformed a tragedy into a fortune. It was all there, written in Sterling's own precise, arrogant hand. Silas shoved the ledger into his coat, the weight of the truth finally replacing the weight of the guilt he had carried for a decade. But as they prepared to flee, a roar of triumph echoed from the dressing suite down the hall. Lord Sterling had seen the helmet. In his private dressing room, Alistair Sterling stood before a floor-to-ceiling mirror, his chest puffed out like a prize rooster. He admired the way the gold inlay on the helmet caught the gaslight, the steel polished to such a high sheen that it looked like liquid silver. He was surrounded by his sycophants and the visiting European dignitaries, all of them offering hollow praise. Sterling wanted to be more than a businessman tonight. He wanted to be a legend. He reached for the helmet, his fingers brushing the outer steel. "A bit of Birmingham's soul," Sterling announced to the room, his voice dripping with false humility. "Forged by the very hands that serve our empire. It is soft on the inside, as all true power should be, yet unyielding on the outside." He lifted the heavy steel over his head. The crimson velvet, saturated with Silas's invisible concentrated resin, met the warmth of Sterling's skin. For the first few seconds, it felt like luxury, a soft, cooling embrace that cradled his skull. He pulled the visor down, locking himself into his own vanity. He walked into the ballroom, the metal crown gleaming, his head held high as the Duke raised a glass in his honor. But the heat of the ballroom, packed with hundreds of bodies and thousands of gas flames, began to do its work. The horror didn't start with a scream. It started as a subtle tingle, a prickling sensation at the base of his neck. Sterling dismissed it as the heat of the room, but within minutes, the tingle became a frantic, burning itch. Beneath the velvet, the urushiol oil, accelerated by the salt of Sterling's sweat and the rising temperature of his blood, began an aggressive, microscopic war. The chemical fire was melting the cellular bonds of his skin. Sterling tried to maintain his composure while speaking to a countess, but his fingers began to twitch. He reached up, trying to shift the helmet, but the inflammation had already begun. His skin was beginning to weep. The pores, trapped in the airtight seal of the steel and velvet, were screaming as the poison seeped into the deepest layers of his dermis. The itch became a roar. It felt as if 1,000 red-hot needles were being driven into his scalp, his forehead, and his cheeks. He gasped for air, but the visor only trapped the agonizing heat. He reached up to pull the helmet off, but his face had already begun to swell. The steel that had been a symbol of his power was now a vice. "My lord? Is something wrong?" the Duke asked, his brow furrowed as he noticed Sterling's hands clawing at the metal. Sterling couldn't answer. He let out a muffled, guttural groan of pure agony. He stumbled toward a mirror, his vision blurring as the swelling began to shut his eyes. Through the slits of the visor, he saw a monster staring back. A man trapped in a silver cage, his body rejecting its own skin. The pain was so intense that his knees buckled. He collapsed onto the marble floor, the sound of the steel hitting the stone echoing through the silent ballroom. "Get it off!" Sterling finally shrieked, the sound distorted by the metal. "Get it off me! It's burning! It's burning!" The gala turned into a scene of pure chaos. The royal physicians rushed forward, but the helmet wouldn't budge. The inflammation was so severe that the pressure inside the helmet had become immense. Sterling was thrashing on the floor, his fingernails scraping against the gold inlay, leaving trails of blood on the masterpiece he had commissioned. They had to use a set of heavy shears and a pry bar, the very tools of the trade Sterling had looked down upon. When they finally managed to pry the steel away, a collective gasp of horror rippled through the elite. The king was unmasked in the most gruesome way possible. As the helmet came away, the velvet lining, now bonded to the raw, weeping flesh by the chemical reaction, took the skin with it. Sterling wasn't a leader. He was a raw, bleeding wreck, his face a landscape of blisters and ruins. He had been stripped of his armor, his dignity and his humanity in front of the very people he sought to impress. He lay there, a broken man on a marble floor, his vanity having literally consumed him. In the confusion, two figures slipped out of the manor and into the cooling night air. Silas and Ilara didn't look back at the screaming house on the hill. They had the ledger, and they had their lives. Within 48 hours, the contents of the iron ledger were delivered to the offices of the Birmingham Gazette. The scandal broke like a thunderstorm. Sterling's empire crumbled faster than his skin had. The lawsuits, the criminal charges, and the public disgrace followed swiftly, ensuring that the King of Iron would spend the rest of his miserable life behind the cold bars of a prison cell, his face a permanent reminder of the price of his pride. 6 months later, the soot of Birmingham was a world away. On the rugged, windswept coast of Cornwall, a small cottage sat nestled against the cliffs, far from the rhythmic thudding of steam hammers. The air here smelled of salt and wild thyme, not coal and lye. Silas Thorne stood in a small garden, his hands still scarred, but no longer trembling. Beside him, Ilara was tending to a patch of lavender and chamomile, healing herbs that she now knew by heart. She wasn't a scullery ghost anymore. She was a child who had found her voice, even if she still chose to use it sparingly. She looked up at Silas and held out a small, fresh sprig of lavender. Silas took it, the scent washing away the last of the iron filings in his soul. He looked at the tarnished locket she still wore, but now it didn't contain a leaf of poison. Inside was a small, hand-drawn sketch of a forge with a fire that brought warmth, not destruction. The world had moved on. The helmet was now a rusted relic in a police evidence locker, the crimson velvet still stained with the price of a tyrant's vanity. It was a reminder that while the law often sleeps in the face of the rich, the truth has a way of working its way under the skin. You can line your life with the finest silk, you can build walls of iron and crowns of gold, but if your heart is rotten, the truth will eventually melt the mask right off your face. If this story touched your soul or reminded you that justice is a fire that eventually finds its target, please rate this journey from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your support means the world to us. Subscribe to the channel to join us for more tales from the shadows of history, where the forgotten find their voices and the powerful find their reckoning. Until next time, remember, the things we try to hide are often the very things that end up exposing us. Stay safe and keep looking for the truth beneath the velvet.